Looking back a year, Ferrari left the Bahrain pre-season testing session with more uncertainties than assurances. At that time, the hope was to have addressed the limitations of the F175, aiming to field a solid and competitive car right from the start. However, after 3 days of testing, the SF-23 proved to be an open construction site, with a somewhat unusual program in search of confirmations to enlighten engineers about the behavior of a car deemed unpredictable. Fast forward a year, and Ferrari arrived in Sakhir with a completely revamped car, starting from the concept. The team emerged with some more certainties and several encouraging signs, especially regarding drivability. One of the primary issues that hindered the SF-23 from the tests was the unpredictability of the car, excessively sensitive to external factors such as wind direction and intensity. This was due to an aerodynamic map that struggled at certain yaw angles. At the launch of the SF-24, Enrico Cardilla mentioned that 2 key pillars of the project were to ensure good correlation between wind tunnel simulations and on-track performance. Additionally, there was an emphasis on developing a car that is easier to drive, providing more confidence to the drivers. From this perspective, the initial feedback from the tests is encouraging, as confirmed by team principal Frédéric Vasseur and those inside the cockpit. Charles Leclerc, on the last day of testing, explained that the car does what it should, something that didn't happen at the beginning of last year. He remembered that after the first few days, he was much more worried because the car was very complicated to drive. This year it's easier, so Ferrari starts from a better foundation, but there is still work to do. For now, everything is going according to plan, and there have been no unpleasant surprises. In some ways, the latest edition from Maranello incorporates various concepts from rival teams, albeit in a more conservative and less extreme manner. This approach is understandable as, at the beginning of a new project, starting with a solid and manageable base allows for raising the bar during development. For this reason, the initial testing phase focused mainly on aerodynamic assessments and understanding the current package. The first goal was to confirm correlations between track, wind tunnel, and simulation systems using numerous sensors mounted on the car. This scanning work understandably took up a significant portion of the first day. However, by Thursday, more in-depth setup tests commenced with repeated programs on the same tire compound to have consistent references, accounting for fuel loads and temperature increases during the morning session. Leclerc opened the second day by running only on the C3 on relatively short runs, consisting of an out lap, a hot lap, a pit lane entry, another push lap, and a final return to the pits to review data and make setup adjustments. The red flag caused by a drain cover issue in turn 11 slightly altered the plans, delaying the long-run programs by almost 2 hours. Charles Leclerc took advantage of the first hour of the afternoon session to begin long stints on the intermediate compound of Pirelli's slick range. However, he had to run when the track temperature was close to 40 degrees Celsius. Notably, there was more pronounced degradation with a fully fueled car, but with less aggressive mappings than the race simulations completed on the last day. In the afternoon, the driving duties shifted to Sainz, who divided the program into 2 different segments, setup work on C3 and C4, to have some reference on a softer compound with a lighter car, potentially beneficial for the rest of the season. This also gives drivers the opportunity to understand how the car reacts with a tire that provides more grip for a single lap. In the late afternoon, after 5 p.m. when the track temperature dropped below 30 degrees C, Carlos Sainz began his race simulation. It is interesting to note that Ferrari, on the second day, used less aggressive mappings than those used by Leclerc on the last day, resulting in a noticeable difference in top speed on the main straight in favor of the Monegasque. However, there are other differences between the race simulations of the 2 Ferrari drivers. Observing Sainz's C3 stint on the second day, it can be noted that the Spaniard starts with a very aggressive attack time, contrary to Leclerc, who has a more linear introduction. The comparison in the second and third stints varies, given Ferrari's decision to reverse the order of the compounds used. Still, interesting aspects of comparison can be observed. When compared to Charles Leclerc, Carlos Sainz's lap times seem relatively high, especially in the middle stint. However, there are differences in terms of approach. The Spaniard often showed more caution in the second sector, like in turn 4, or in the direction change from 6 to 7 to push in turn 12, one of the most demanding sections for the tires due to the loads it imposes in a very rapid segment. With Charles Leclerc, the opposite behavior was observed, with more aggressive mid-sectors at the expense of better management in turn 12. This information is useful for understanding how the tires react to different tire-saving modes, considering the differences in setup between the two drivers. On the third day, the roles behind the wheel of the SF-24 were reversed, with Carlos Sainz taking the lead. In the morning, the focus was on a fixed plan, with 5 runs of approximately 8 laps each, all on C3 with a significant fuel load, to assess the car's reactions to specific setup changes in similar conditions. After the low fuel runs for Charles Leclerc, the final part of the tests was dedicated to the Monegasque's race simulation, albeit cut short due to FIA-mandated tests to verify the correct functioning of all procedures for activating the virtual safety car and the red flag. As anticipated, these last stints used more aggressive mappings than those used in the previous days and were intended to simulate a more real situation to gather useful data on tire consumption, the true weakness of the SF-23. The most convincing stint was on the C1, the central run, not necessarily due to pure tire consumption, but due to the performance degradation ratio. The hardest compound in the slick range didn't cause significant headaches for teams in terms of durability during testing. Still, apart from Red Bull, Ferrari managed to be convincing in terms of lap times relative to the observed degradation. While some teams showed good degradation in the race simulation, they couldn't match Leclerc's times. Others preferred a differentiated program, conducting only long runs without revealing too much. It is interesting to note that Ferrari chose a more linear introduction without simulating an undercut attempt, while there was a more pronounced degradation on the C3, the soft for the upcoming weekend, with a full fuel load. More than the performance, an aspect on which Leclerc did not want to elaborate, awaiting next week, what gives confidence at Ferrari is primarily the driving characteristics of the new car, appearing more neutral with a wider setup window compared to the SF-23. The car from the previous season presented limitations that required a specific driving style, often at odds with Leclerc's preferences, even though, on some occasions and depending on the tracks, it was possible to compensate. The new prancing horse has shown positive signs, and according to the drivers, this will also provide greater flexibility in tire management. The goal was also to improve in medium-speed corners, especially those with rapid changes of direction where a good front end is needed without penalizing efficiency. The Sakhir track may not be the most suitable for thoroughly evaluating potential improvements, as other circuits will provide a clearer and more meaningful picture, also in terms of overall balance. However, the drivers also emphasized that the SF-24 seems to be less sensitive to the wind, another weak point of the old car, an element never lacking in Bahrain. Fred Vasseur did not want to commit to the value of the new car at the end of the tests, but also highlighted an important aspect. A few tenths, depending on the tracks, could make a difference in the grid order.